Hello and welcome to this edition of White Swan Foundation's Moving Minds webinar on in the times of COVID-19. This is Manoj Chandran. White Swan Foundation is a non-profit organization that delivers knowledge services for mental health and well-being. We have developed India's largest knowledge services repository on mental health, available in multiple languages and serves thousands every day, so that they could make more informed decisions on matters related to mental health care. Our Moving Minds platform is an opportunity for people to interact directly with us and mental health experts on a wide range of subjects. Today, we discuss the topic of comprehending the new normal during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been nearly 6 weeks since we in India have been practicing physical distancing and participating in the lockdown. Ever since India began to report COVID-19 positive cases, we've been coping with the changes we've never been prepared for. Consequently, as experts in previous editions of Moving Minds webinars pointed out, mental health issues seem to have gone up and taken center stage. We have begun speaking about going back to normal days in several parts of the country. Lockdown conditions are being eased in some places. People have started going back to work in some other cities. It's time we understand and try and understand what would be the normal conditions look like in the near term. Would they be exactly like those pre-COVID days, or are we looking at a new normal here? To discuss some of these interesting questions, I have with me as guests two very special experts today. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Shekhar Saxena. Dr. Saxena is a professor of the practice of global mental health at the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health. A psychiatrist by training, Dr. Saxena was the director of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse at the World Health Organization from 2010 to 2018. During his leadership at the WHO's Mental Health Action Plan was adopted by the World Health Assembly, and mental health and well-being was included in the United States Sustainable Development Goals. His expertise include providing evidence-based advice and technical assistance to policymakers on mental health promotion and prevention and management of mental health, developmental, neurological, and substance use disorder and suicide prevention. Welcome, Dr. Saxena, to this edition of Moving Minds.
Thank you very much, Manoj, for inviting me.
I'm also happy to introduce our second guest, Aparna Joshi. Aparna is an assistant professor at the School of Human Ecology, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, teaching applied psychology. Practicing as a psychotherapist for the last 24 years, Aparna also leads iCall, one of India's largest technology-assisted counseling services for individuals with psychosocial distress. Aparna has worked with several government and non-government organizations to envision and implement mental health care services in clinical, community, and institutional settings. Welcome, Aparna.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for inviting me.
Before we start, I would like to request our viewers to put in their questions in the chat window. I'd be happy to bring your questions up with our guests as we get into the discussion. So let's just set the context here and try and understand your views on the state of affairs on the ground. Let me try and get your views, Aparna, to begin with. As a social scientist, how do you describe what has happened in our society due to the pandemic and the lockdown? The shifts our society has experienced over the last 2 months. What are the broad areas where the society has felt the impact on?
Yeah. So thank you, Manoj, for inviting me for this discussion and for asking this question. And it's very broad-based question. So I'll try my very best to, capture some of the key issues. And as the conversation unfolds, I think we can detail it further. But I think when I thought of this question first, I wanted to say that there is a discourse which has created a new language of COVID being an equalizer. And I want to say that while it has been equalizer connecting the globe, it has also been bringing some existing or pre-existing barriers also out. So first question I want to ask, whose lockdown are we talking about? Because not everybody's lockdown has been the same. It has adversely affected some people, and some people, may have been scratched. But to give you some of the effects that I see on the larger social fabric, I think words like anxiety or some kind of fear have entered our everyday vocabulary on a regular basis, I think. And it has created a general environment of fear and anxiety among our minds and communities and societies. Secondly, I see a paradox of social connection that this pandemic has created. So on one hand, we are all yearning that the lockdown gets over and we get to the so-called normal or the new normal, but there is also anxiety about resuming this connection. There is also social distancing, which has led to sometimes fear, suspicion. The role of state and surveillance and police has suddenly gained importance in the social fabric, which are institutions we know exist, but they have come to the center stage. So we want to go back, but there are mixed feelings about going back. And perhaps this is going to last longer. I think this is also seen to family institution. So while India boasts about its institution, family, and how it leads to a sense of connection and collectivism, we have also received number of calls saying that staying within the same family is becoming very difficult for people day by day. So while people are drawing energy, people are also negotiating for space. So I think this is a very interesting observation. Technology suddenly seems to become a panacea for all the problems, right? People, I mean, I work with a technology assisted service, and we all know that while it's a very important tool, but we also know that we are a very offline culture which is very visual, face to face. So I think this is going to be an interesting transition. People have deep insights about life, about what's important. People are telling us that, you know, I had developed coping mechanisms which were so dependent upon external support systems or external mechanisms, and I don't have what it takes perhaps to create internal ones. So there are deeper insights about existence, environment also that people are going through. And I feel that humanity is face to face with vulnerability in a very core sense. And it has humbled us also. It has frightened us also. But I will end my narrative by saying a couple of good things also, definitely. I think it has brought together any time of upheaval is also time for change, innovation. So it has brought innovations in connections, in virtual worlds. It has also, I think, highlighted the importance of connections, cooperation, and partnerships. We all have understood how interconnected our lives are. It has also made us aware of migrants, laborers, many of the domestic workers whose services we have taken for granted. I think it has made us grateful about their existence, and hopefully it will lead to some deeper insights which will lead to deeper change also in the long run.
Thank you, Aparna. I think that's a great way to sum up the observations, actually, which ranges from challenges, hope to resilience and innovation also. Dr. Saxena, from a behavioral science perspective, at an individual level, and you certainly bring in a global perspective to it, how do you see, what are the top level observations that you make that the human race across the world has experienced over the last 2 months?
Sorry, Manoj, the main factors psychologically and mentally is to begin with fear that something could happen. Something could happen to me, something could happen to my family, my friends, my colleague, my country. And fear is a very strong emotion along with apprehension. And the third thing is lack of control over what will happen. So people feel fear, apprehension, and inability to control the environment around them, inability to control the future. And those are very strong psychological stressors on all of us. And this is happening globally. In fact, we have seen many other epidemics like the Ebola in Africa, and also many other natural disasters and conflicts all around the world. But perhaps there is no example of a threat which is happening to almost everybody on this earth. So it is a very serious issue psychologically, and we are reacting to it. Looking at it from another viewpoint, our brain functions the best in a familiar and a predictable environment. And these are the two things which are actually missing right now. So we are experiencing a hyper arousal of brain. we are experiencing a constant feeling of alertness and anxiety. And that for a short time is okay. In fact, for a short time, it could be constructive because we are now making attempts to protect ourselves. And this kind of reaction from the body and the mind is very important. It's very constructive. It's helpful. But if extended for a longer period of time, it has very serious consequences. And it's no surprise that a very large number of people are feeling very anxious, very fearful, and also in some cases very depressed, because the effect of lack of complete control over what is going to happen eventually leads to depression. So all of us are feeling that. Some of us are having stress, many others are having distress, and some of us are actually having frank anxiety and depression, even to the extent of having a disorder. And this reaction is very similar for many other kind of mass threats, including natural disasters, earthquakes, conflicts, and wars. And there are many studies to suggest from the past that the prevalence of mental disorders increases almost 5 times during these circumstances. And it's not a surprise that there will be a massive increase in the numbers of people who have a mental distress or a mental disorders, leading to disability. And all of this, when we are experiencing it together, actually increases the need for social connectedness, because that's a very important coping mechanism for all of us. We are, after all, social animals. And while all of this is happening, our social connectedness is actually decreased because we cannot visit people. We find difficult to talk to people. We are not near them. And one important example of that, of a kind of miscommunication, is the guidance on what is called the social distancing, which actually is a misnomer. We should be saying physical distancing with increased social connectedness. So it's very unfortunate that this term has been chosen by national authorities, also by international authorities, to communicate what actually should be a physical distancing and increased social connectiveness and social support. So these are some of the things that we are all experiencing. Some of us are coping up well, some of us are not coping up so well, but what we really need is more awareness, more attention, and more resources for mental health from the community, from the employers, from civil society partners, and also for the government. So yes, I think the agenda is very clear, and we need to really take action on that.
Thank you, Doctor. I think that's a powerful summary, I would say, and very intense. And I really want to pick up a few very powerful points that you brought up. And I thought we should start with the first word that you picked up, Doctor, fear. And it will be really nice for our audience to really understand and build some control on that. If you can help them be self-aware of that they're getting into fear and fear is taking control. So if you can spend some time on that aspect of fear, and perhaps the first manifestation that got reported also, if you look at the moment we started saying that COVID has reached the shores and into the country, people had fear as the first outburst of emotion. And it opened up in many ways. It opened up in, for instance, the first thing that I personally saw was trust deficit among people also, actually. So if I could understand, how does the brain react to fear? The moment fear touches the brain, how does it react? The brain reacts to it. And how can one become self-aware of this emotion and manage that, Doctor?
Well, fear is one of the most important emotions, and it's also a biological phenomenon. Essentially, fear is protective. If there is a threat, we feel fear and we take action. And that action could be either a fight or a flight. Either we like fear is of for example, a predator for an animal, and the animal either fights or goes away. in human beings, the fear is not only of the direct external threat that we can see, it's also from awareness that something could be coming. And that something could be very discrete, which could be very, very clearly described, or in many cases, that threat is something which is intangible, but it's still there. There is danger, but we don't know what. And some of the communications around coronavirus have been very, very threatening, because we all hear the kind of things which are happening in some other country, in some other community, and now we feel it's coming to us. And that kind of communications can be extremely fearful and anxiety provoking. So we not only feel fear in our emotions, it also affects our thinking, and it actually affects our physiological functions. We become hyper aroused, our heart rate increases, our respiratory rate increases, we have more tense muscles, and all of that leads to some other changes, like we cannot sleep well, we cannot rest, our appetite goes down. In fact, in some cases, the appetite goes up because we have the comfort of eating more. And all these physiological changes, if prolonged for some time, have very adverse effect on our body as well as our mind. And that is what is happening, because now the fear is prolonged. It's not only a day, it's not only a week, it's many months now. The other factor behind fear is also the unpredictability of it. The messages are changing every day, sometimes every hour. And that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance and arousal. Because we know if something has changed in the last 1 hour, it could change more adversely in the next hour. So there is lack of predictability and also a constantly changing environment, which actually causes a lot of anxiety. And all of that has major effect on our behavior also. Now, how do we behave in the face of all of that fear? We seek reassurance, and we seek support. And during these times, in fact, these are the two commodities which are in short supply. Nobody is giving us reassurance and nobody is giving us support. And that is really a remarkably difficult situation for many of us to cope with. And any action that could actually reinforce those will be extremely helpful, and people are seeking it actively. I'll point out a couple of things which are creating even more problem. One is lack of clear and credible information. And you talked about the lack of trust. Some people have even a lack of trust in the government-led communications because they don't trust the local government or the other governments. And that creates even more anxiety because they don't know what to listen to them. There is no credible source of information. The second is misinformation, and sometimes deliberately false and misinformation, which can be extremely threatening. And one of the solutions to that is actually to listen only to credible sources of information and not have too much of it. If you're seeking information every minute, every hour, then it can become very overwhelming. So we should decide that we listen to information maybe once a day or maybe twice a day, which is important because that information can be life-saving. And also misinformation can be very destructive. So those are some of the impacts of fear that we are facing, almost all of us. COVID is affecting a few thousand people and is obviously very unfortunate that is killing some people. But all of us, millions and billions of people are affected by the fear, which seems to be having a lot of adverse effect on our body and mind.
And it becomes more challenging, like you pointed out, that without this reassurance and supportive environment around it, the whole responsibility becomes lies on the individual to become self-aware and find ways to manage that. And like you gave a great suggestion to be very selective in the source that will give you information and valuable information at that, so that you make right decisions. Now, when fear grips us, doctor, of course, I mean, there are immediate changes, physical and psychological. Do those changes stay with us for a long time? when we get back to business as usual, do we say that, okay, fear has gone? Does it immediately go just the way it has come?
Unfortunately not. It seems both. The sources of fear are likely to continue for some time. Coronavirus is just not going to disappear from the earth so quickly. So there will be constant need to be careful, which means we will have to have some anxiety, some fear, but also the circumstances, the way they are developing. In fact, even the social circumstances and economic circumstances which are changing, fear and anxiety is going to remain with us for a very long time. For some people, extremely high level of it. People maybe not that high. So both the causes of fear and the perception of fear will continue for quite some time. And this can actually become a long-term disability for many people, because our body and mind, if they're constantly in this state of excessive fear and alertness for a prolonged time, can actually undergo changes which will have impact on the way we think, on the way we have emotions, the way we behave. And that could be, again, constructive, because we need to have some fear, otherwise we will take undue chances. As soon as the lockout is released, we might just go out and do those things which we wanted to do for the last 2 months, and some of them can actually be very unsafe. So that fear can be constructive, but then it can be too much of it. So then we continue to react even if the external environment has become safer, and we don't do things which now we can safely do. So some people will still not go out. Some people will still be very fearful of meeting unknown people, for example, or taking public transport or going back to work. And that's where long-term changes are possible in many people. And I must say, as a psychiatrist, that in some cases, this will give rise to a long-term mental disorder and disability. We should not also forget that a large number of people have a pre-existing anxiety or depressive disorder, in some cases even more severe disorder like psychosis. And the current crisis is creating more disability, more symptoms in them. And that is decompensation, which is going to last a much longer time. So in otherwise normal people, but also in people who have pre-existing problems, this is not going to disappear tomorrow. It's going to be there for months and years.
Doctor, one of the ways I've noticed the fear manifests into actions, in our actions, is in the relationship space. Our relationship with our family members and that of the neighbors and our community. And how do you describe that, and how do you see relationship getting impacted because of the fear, and we becoming mindful of those actions of ours and course correct that whenever we could?
I think some of the communications that we are receiving are very sort of not very helpful in that sense. Let me give you an example just to position it well. One of our persons known to us gets an infection, and that person has to seek help. That person has to go to hospital. And as a person who looks after and maybe cares for that person, you would like to be helpful. And unfortunately, that's not possible. You cannot visit the hospital. You cannot sometimes even talk to the person. And unfortunately, like it is happening in many cases, if the person actually goes into ICU and dies, you cannot even express your sympathies, your condolences. You cannot attend the funeral. And that can be extremely stressful, not only for the family, but also for a large number of colleagues and other people. So it is affecting the way we interact with people. And there are a lot of restrictions which are there because of fear, as well as the required safety mechanisms. And that's coloring all our relationship. We are told that when we go out, we should wear masks, which actually hides our facial expressions and emotions. So even if we are near somebody, we are not that emotional. We are not connecting to people simply because we have to stay far away. We have to wear a mask. We cannot be open. We cannot hug people, which is our traditional way of showing enthusiasm and emotions. So fear is coloring each aspect of this, which actually is extremely unhelpful. It may be required to some extent, but I think in many cases, it can become by itself a major problem. And we have to gradually overcome that to the extent that we can. So although we are not supposed to go and meet people, but we can always ring people up. We can always chat with them. We can be socially connected. And we must take a full advantage of that so that we are, as I was saying earlier, socially connected and getting the support that we need. But also we are prepared for the future where things can sort of normalize, and then we will not be required to say, I'm meeting you after 3 months. We'll say, we connected yesterday by phone and today we can meet, which is much more helpful.
So this is a great, again, I know, summary of how fear has impacted an individual's behavior. And Aparna, if you could look at from the social perspective, in the first few weeks, our fear had led to several unfortunate incidences in the society. It was demonstrated in the forms of violence and hatred, stigma and ostracization in the society, in many parts. I'm not generalizing, but you've seen that in many reports. What happens in the society when a collective fear takes a dominant place? We've also, to be truthful, we've also seen great level of demonstration of empathy towards those who were victims of these actions. But we've largely seen a lot of unfortunate incidences. So how do you see the social space enacting the fear, collective fear that we have?
Right. So I think I would like to start from home and then move on to society, because I feel that this environment of everybody being locked down at home with so much of uncertainty, lack of control, and being triggered by each other's presences also is creating a lot of anxiety within the household, first of all. I think it's affecting the fabric of interpersonal relationships within the household itself, whereby, for example, I can use ICOL's data or whatever narratives we are hearing. People felt that they had gotten over many of their demons, many of their old issues, and they are suddenly discovering that those old issues of anxiety, fear within the household are suddenly being triggered or being manifested. So I think within the household also, and in milder forms, it could be conflicts. In more severe forms, we are hearing about cases of domestic violence or some, violations of people's rights also. For example, many women are calling us and telling us that negotiating for household work is becoming such a struggle for them, and the entire burden because of the traditional gender roles of working, caring, nurturing is falling on women. Yeah. So I think within household, this is the effect. Now, if you go out and talk about fear in the larger community, I think there are two sources of fear. One, as Doctor already said, is related to corona and health information, which is generic, which is changing, which is not targeted for specific population, which is not even mindful of people's social realities. Even when we tell people to maintain physical distance, we are also talking about slums where 15 people are staying in the same household. We are asking people to wash hands, use sanitizers when people don't have one soap, or they are using towels which are community owned. So I just want to say that I think even the messaging is very confusing and it's not created individually targeted, number one. Number two, I think there is a lot of fear of uncertainty about how life is going to open at the community level. Whether the schools are going to start, whether the job cuts are going to happen, whether I will get my salary, whether people can use transportation, whether I can take my wife who is pregnant to a healthcare service. I think there is so much of confusion around, and people are very, very watchful. I think Doctor was talking about the utility of fear. In fact, there is a very interesting phenomenon that we are realizing, that worry feels safe. People worry because they feel by worrying they are doing something to prevent catastrophic consequences. So there is a utility of worry, but of course, excessive worry is going to cause some problem. But I think sometimes this worry is justified because of the possible economic consequences, because of possible, you can see reverse migration, right? What is going to happen to cities? What is going to happen to labor force? Whether the organizations will open or not, I think none of us know answers, and that is also causing a lot of fear, a lot of worry. Another thing we can see that communalism is also very high. You know, suspicion, prejudices, one can see that while people are also coming together and supporting each other and phoning each other, there is also an atmosphere of suspicion against some castes, certain particular sects of society, and one can see violence. For example, you are hearing cases of violence against health workers, against certain sects of societies. So I think it's also fanning some of the divides or prejudices that existed, and now they are targeted under the name of Corona. I'm not saying that's intentionally happening, but the sort of larger thing is around Corona. So I just feel that the fear is operating at several levels. You don't know, I mean, people are sort of making enemies out of regular others, you know, where you should be connecting and drawing energy from each other. Everybody is treated with a lot of suspicion. I think there is fear about healthcare services also. Anyway, our healthcare services which pre-existed were subpar and not so adequate. Now there is an additional burden. So people are scared that, will I get essential healthcare services which were unavailable earlier? So I think fear is about social fabric, economic consequences, and definitely about healthcare or about relationships also. I think it exists at so many levels, and it's a fertile ground for bringing people together or maybe dividing them also.
Thank you, Aparna. And Dr. Saxena, we've looked at some aspects of the behavioral changes that we would expect because of the virus itself and many other aspects. Now, this whole lockdown concept, we had not even heard of that word 2 months ago, actually, before 2 months. So, and suddenly, even a 7-year-old knows what lockdown means. What happens to an individual when a huge shift, tectonic shift in the way one lives itself is been redefined? How do they cope with it? We talk about human resilience. Do resilience really help and solve the problems that people, for instance, face due to this situation of lockdown, that you can't go out, you can't meet anybody? And what can people do? Of course, we talk about general solution about well-being, and we can do many things. But generally, when there is a huge shift in lifestyle, in the way you're supposed to live, how do you address that? How do you become mindful of those changes that have begun to happen to you, and then say that I think I need course corrections?
Well, interesting question. And we can certainly talk about a few possible solutions, but I don't think anybody of us can actually fathom the kind of adaptations that we are making and will be required to make in future. We react to any sudden change in our environment somewhat adversely, because any change requires us to adapt with mind, with body, and that can be creating its own stress. And in this case, the change has been very massive and very sudden. Within days or within weeks, we were told that there is a serious external threat and this is what you need to do. And that changed the whole world upside down. We could not go out to work. We could not go to schools. We were told that this is what you can do, and the boundaries are very strict. And for some people, it made a very serious change of not being able to even go home. They were stranded. And all of that is creating a very major problem. And we try to cope up with that in a variety of ways. But one important way of coping is to utilize internal resources. Usually, we are using our own habitual coping mechanisms to do that. And that is something that all of us are required to do. It varies from person to person. Some of us find just sitting quietly and thinking as a good coping mechanism, but other people want to talk to others. in a way to decrease one's anxiety and fear. We can take help of the usual methods of diversion of mind, because mind is being impacted all the time with these very negative news. We can go into music, reading something, or doing something which gives us pleasure. And we are all using these mechanisms. But for some people, it's going back to work, which is a very important coping mechanism, because that's how we have dealt with it earlier. And in many cases, that's not possible because we cannot get back to work. So all of that are things that we're trying to do. But one important way of coping is actually to adapt our behavior, because that decreases the threat value. And we are all doing that. We find other ways of doing the same thing which gave us pleasure or reassurance. So we might be working from home computer, we might be working in a very different way. We might think about picking up old hobbies that we never had time to do. So those are things that we are all using. But one important element which Aparna already referred to is actually to connect with other people. And within the limitations that are with us, because we cannot go and visit people, we are all finding ways to connect with people, which is a very, very important mechanism for adapting. And this is being done all in a very quick time frame. Within days or weeks, we are asked to do all of these things. And some of us are succeeding very well, some others are not succeeding well. I'd like to point out a few things that all of us can do to cope up better with our own stresses. One of them is to follow a routine, even if the circumstances don't allow it very well. So we should have at least some semblance of routine, that this is what we are going to do. This is the time we are going to get up from bed. This is what we are going to do. Maintain some kind of routine meal times. Keep time for socialization in whatever way it is possible. Also look after our sleep very well, because one of the impacts of anxiety and fear is just not being able to sleep. And we might be awake late in the night, listening to all the negative news, which actually makes you not sleep at all. So maintaining good sleep, maintaining good nutrition, maintaining some kind of physical exercise routine, even if physical exercise is going to be very difficult because we can't visit, we can't walk outside, we can't go to the gym. All of that is extremely important. One additional aspect which I am very aware that is creating a problem is overindulgence on tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. Because that's, for some people, a very important coping mechanism. And that should be absolutely curtailed. Obviously, even the supply is curtailed. So in that sense, it is helpful. But some people do indulge more in that. Obviously, it gives quick relief, but over a period of time, it can be very, very harmful. The last thing I want to point out is to take pride in confidence in what we are able to do, because we are all at this point of time normal people in highly abnormal circumstances, and we are trying our best. So even if we are able to do some work remotely, we should be very happy doing that, and should give us some confidence. And one more thing connected to that is to seek help and get help, even if that's not our inclination. Most of us believe that nothing can happen to us, but things are happening to you, and you should be willing to accept that you are under stress, you need help, and you should be seeking help and receiving help, even if very informal help from family members, from other people. And actually, the act of providing help to somebody else is actually very helpful to ourselves also. So seeking help, giving help, receiving help of whatever kind, it can be financial, it can be social, it can be just talking to people, it can be doing something for others, is actually very helpful. And that really diverts our mind from the immediate problem to the act of doing something, which is extremely helpful.
That's really helpful.
I will just add to what Dr. Saxena has said. And definitely, I think the last point that he made, that enough research to show that if you engage in helping others or altruistic behavior, it definitely, does a lot of good to you. It takes care of your emotional regulation as you are helping others regulate. I just wanted to add a couple of other coping strategies also that people can use. I think being not insisting that my old coping strategies have to be used all the time. Yeah, letting go of that insistence and saying that I have to now adapt and be creative. Number one. Number two, I also want to say that letting go of your need for perfection, control, and certainty, which is very easy to say but very difficult to follow for people. And we have been telling people that they say that, but I used to do so much of work, I don't feel motivated, I feel that there is so much of time, but my productivity has decreased. So you just have to say that it's okay. And showing some kind of a self-compassion as well as other compassion is important. And American Psychological Association is also telling us two things. One is social media is much more harmful than perhaps any other media. So curtailing that, and anyway curtailing overall media. So I just feel that these are some of the things. And also FOMO. A lot of people are telling us, oh, there are so many webinars, there is so much of information. What if I don't consume that information? I'm missing something valuable, but they're not asking a very vital question to themselves. Are they doing this to cope for themselves, or are they doing this because others believe that this is the best way to cope? So I think just being connected to who you are and what you want from life, also maybe dwelling into some of the new existentialist insights that you are gaining, although uncomfortable, but I think staying with them can maybe change our life perspective. So I think these are some of the things that I just wanted to add.
Very good.
I'll just add to what Aparna was saying. Coronavirus has put a pause on our life, and maybe we can push the reset button, which will be very helpful.
Yes, Doctor. I really want to get into a little deeper on the social connectedness part, Doctor, which you brought up earlier. But before that, we've got a very interesting question come up on the screen from a viewer. Dharmendra is asking this question. We're all asked to stay at home with family in face of fear and all the assurance and support that we need. Family with whom we are living are best placed to offer that. Why is that it then should be an issue? I think we all as individuals have been able to look inwards and take care of ourselves outside of our own self. We're always dependent even on family, and that's the problem in times like this. Is this not a signal to go inside of us and maintain calm and peace triggered by self? So this whole concept of family, and that's been a coping mechanism for almost all of us actually. Suddenly, family need not necessarily be the coping mechanism source for us. How do you look at that? New way of suddenly discovering that, okay, no, family is not necessarily always I should rely on. Doctor, if you could start, and then you can come to Aparna also.
Well, I think Aparna will answer that much better than I will do. But family means very different things for different people. Some people rely upon family much more and derive a lot of pleasure as well as support from other family members. And some people are much more individualistic and they rely on practical things from the family, but not emotionally and not in way of psychological support. So I think it will vary from person to person. But at this point of time, when you are really forced to stay with a family, you need to make the best of that as possible. And as we were discussing earlier, not only for yourself, but for others in the family. And that itself can be very, very rewarding and can be very helpful. But in some way, rediscover the joys of being with other people. Because earlier, many people spent 8 hours outside the home and outside the family, but suddenly now they are in much more touch. And to establish newer connections and to find newer ways of assisting others to assist oneself and deriving pleasure is something that we all need to explore. That's not to say that we should not look for internal resources, which are anyway important, but I think a combination of that is extremely helpful. my last point is coming back to what Aparna pointed out. In some families, there is a problem of asymmetry, as well as in some cases, aggression and violence, which can actually get accentuated because you are now forced to be in that situation. And for some people, it can be extremely traumatic. So to be aware of that and to take precautions that does not harm a certain member of family much more, and to provide help, even if sometimes from outside, is something which is extremely necessary, because some people can get extremely traumatized by being in the constant company of others who might be bullies, who might be violent, and who can be very destructive for their emotional and social life.
Aparna, if you have a view on, and certainly the family as a social construct.
So I think let me point out two kinds of narratives that I hear, and I'm again drawing from ICOL's data.
Yes.
So there are people who are living single lives, elderly, single people, who are really yearning to be with their families, people who are stranded somewhere, who couldn't go home, students who are, in some other states and had some other plans. They are yearning to go back to family. But we also hear another narrative, and many of you might be aware of this very famous family therapist called Murray Bowen. And he says that one of the issues that leads to conflicts in families is the imbalance between togetherness and connectedness. Yeah. So we want families, but we want a balance of connectedness and space also. Yeah. And right now, I think that balance is unfortunately really not achievable, given the fact that everybody is locked down. If you look at a larger social level, the culture itself is, Indian culture itself is transitioning, right? While we pride ourselves on being a collectivist culture and family being a big source of support, we are also moving towards values of autonomy, individualism, which were once considered to be very Western values. So I think young people are voicing the need, particularly from our calls also, to definitely have that space and that balance between togetherness. Now, whoever is the underdog within the family, for example, women or children, who may not have that much power over what gets done, decision making, participation, labor within the family, are also experiencing the pinch of it or the negative effects of it. And many people are really being triggered by being locked in the same house where there is perpetration of child sexual abuse, domestic violence. Family, while it is a great source of support in India, is traditionally a hierarchical institution. We all know that. And those hierarchies are unfortunately emerging in a much more exacerbated ways. But let me also tell you a very heartening part of it. One is people are also drawing a lot of energy from each other through their rituals. And secondly, people are renegotiating their relationships also. People are telling us that this is a great opportunity for us to maybe talk about some of the issues that they had skirted under the table and never looked at them. See, we are also a very different culture. We act, we don't discuss phenomena and emotions in Indian families. I think people are resorting to different ways of communication, dividing labor, negotiating relationships. So I think there is a good part to it also. And I think the balance between drawing from, as Dr. Saxena already said, from within, from family. And I want to tell you that if family is not that resource, then whoever is your resource, it could be your friends, it could be your chosen family, it could be your work colleagues. But I think staying connected and drawing from those social connections is extremely important for your mental health, and giving to those social connections is also important for your mental health.
So this whole concept of social connectedness, of course, we keep saying that being socially active is an extremely important requirement for an emotional well-being, our emotional well-being. And in the age of technology, we are seeing much better connectedness. Yet in the current time, suddenly this whole technology-assisted socially active life is being tested. And so how do you see that whole test? I mean, do you think this whole new definition of social activeness is passing the test of test through the technology that we have, the social media, be it, or any other platform that people use to connect among themselves, among friends and co-workers and all. Do you see that they feel connected? Do you see that that is really aiding their emotional well-being today? Aparna, you could probably take it.
Yeah. So I feel that, yeah, I think there is yes and no both. And it is changing every week. Again, I want to highlight that we cannot create a monolithic narrative of lockdown, because with every passing week, let me give you a very concrete example. When the lockdown happened, and it happened much later in India compared to some of the other developed countries also, towards the end of March, people, for example, who had never opened their mobile phones or technology assisted, devices, elderly or others, suddenly, started WhatsApping, connecting. People said, oh, let's get together over Zoom, let's have fun, let's connect. That was the enthusiasm around technology. Some were struggling to transition from face-to-face to a technology-assisted work environment, right? People were struggling to create a designated space to see each other, not really, but virtually. I think there were struggles of that sort also. And with each passing day, I feel that the enthusiasm or the curiosity has now become a compulsion also. It has become a strategy for survival, right? We can't survive now without technology. But with that comes fatigue. With that comes some sort of avoidance also. So I'm hearing about webinar fatigue. I'm hearing about people after 2 meetings of connecting each other, or family members after talking to each other, feel really fatigued, because there is an artificiality of social connection through virtual connections. Some people are also telling us if the phone rings, they start palpitating. They want to avoid. See, Dr. Saxena was talking about anxiety. One of the things that anxiety makes you do is avoid. Earlier, there was anxiety made us connect, made us consume information. Now people are also flooded. Their systems are so flooded. So I'm saying that this technology, we are not a technology driven culture. We are talking of a bunch of a few who were well versed with technology and comfortable, but the large India is not. So there is inevitability, but the transition seems to be full of challenges is what I want to say. And the challenges are changing every week. So let's not create one narrative of technology, and let's not look at technology as a panacea which will answer all our life problems. We require offline and online solution, and being associated with technology assisted sort of a service, still I say we require offline solution.
Manoj,
Yes,
I'd
Doctor.
just like to add that media is, after all, just media. It provides a method of connection, but what happens once that connection is established is more important. It's the message which is more important than just the act of connecting. So social media can be very much more threatening, as Aparna was saying, but it can also be very consoling, because you're connected, you're deriving some kind of support from that. So I think using technology is okay. We can use more of it, but we should be very mindful of what we are achieving by connecting with that. And that can vary a lot.
Manoj, I want to add one more point here, that technology also should be consumed very respectfully and consensually. Yeah? We are hearing about many cases in India, and especially among teenagers, people who are locked at home. Sometimes technology is also used not so constructively to communicate. It is also violating people's rights and violating people's territory. So I think we have to be very, very mindful of that. And be respectful also in our communication and warm in our communication.
Yes, certainly. I think it's important to also keep that. I think the key message here is that while we could use technology, but the responsibility of identifying the content we want to consume and believing in it, and then acting on those content that we consume is very important. I mean, we have to be very mindful again of what are we doing with that, the content, and so that's very important. Aparna, I really wanted to understand the structural changes in the society. You've spoken about in many aspects of our discussion of how society really looked at COVID, the fear, and many ways. What structural changes in the society have you seen over the last 2 months? Not that these structural changes have happened suddenly, but they have come out to the fore. Suddenly we became aware of the structures that existed, for instance, like you pointed out classically. I mean, we would probably never have given so much of importance of visibility to migrant community. And we now do that. We understand their importance in our lives. So how have you been able to observe this? And what do you see is the new normal again from a societal perspective going ahead?
So as you rightly pointed out, it is not that some of these disparities have suddenly come due to COVID. I think they did exist before COVID happened. I think they have glaringly become visible because of COVID. Yeah. And those disparities are related to class. Those disparities are also related to gender. And I want to again and again highlight. And by gender, I'm not referring to gender binary of men, women, where women have been at the lower end of the hierarchy. But we are also receiving calls from people who are with diverse sexual and gender expressions, which goes beyond the binary also, feeling the sort of victimization or feeling negative effects of these disparities. Definitely, I think economic disparities have come out in a major way. We are receiving calls that I call about people not being able to connect to essential services. That's why I said, whose lockdown are we talking about is also extremely important. While some people, the lockdown can be about singing and discovering themselves and finding new things to do and hobbies, for some people, it's just a struggle to survive. For some people, their shelters are gone, their food is gone, the relief work itself is showing a lot of cracks in the economic and the development of our country, because the relief work is very patchy. It's not reaching everybody in a similar way. There are also forces of power that are operating within that. So I think it's bringing a lot of, how should I say, cracks which were existed in the development, even the health system. As I said, that the health system, which was already burdened, now is further overburdened, and we are worried whether the people will have access to essential service, because you can see all new wards are about ventilators, about corona services. So where will pregnant women, where will immunization, where will these basic things happen? So I think the social fabric is also changing in a major way, and I feel that the messages of social distancing, instead of bringing parity, are actually fanning some of these disparities. So I think we have to be very careful around those. But if we focus only on mental health discourse, and I want to make that appeal here, sometimes mental health discourse flattens these disparities. It flattens identities. It assumes that everybody is equal. In a highly unequal society, we need to therefore have a psychosocial discourse to say that our psyches interact with these social, economic, political structures, and then they create distress or they can create solutions. So the solutions can't be only within the individual. They have to be multifaceted, where multiple ministries and people and organizations come together to offer this.
Aparna, we've also seen many natural disasters and many other kind of issues. A single problem binds the society. They come together as a much more powerful entity to try and solve and build resilience collectively. And here also we are seeing that COVID and the coronavirus and the issues around it and lockdown, in many ways is a binding force. I mean, it's like it can possibly bind the entire community, but yet it hasn't really done that like we would probably expect in a natural disaster or even war many times. People come together for a single cause, Why do you see that there is a little bit of a wanting there in people coming together?
Right. I feel that, yes, you are right, that it has brought people together, because I think there is a phenomenon that there is one single entity called Corona, which is affecting all of us. And at some level, as I said, that it has perhaps brought everybody together to fight against that single entity. And it has sort of flattened the disparities or flattened the inequalities or difference. But at another level, I want to differentiate again what I was saying earlier, there is corona and there are health issues, but the subsequent lockdown, containment, and the economic issues, or even the transportation, lack of access to health services, essential services, I think that apart more than corona, I think that seems to be a bigger. I mean, people are also asking questions when 1 to 2% of the people who are infected are actually, at risk of dying. You can see many more who are at risk of losing livelihood, losing their basic connect with society, essential services. So I feel that at one level, if it is bringing people together, at another level, it is bringing the existing disparities at such a massive level that it is difficult. See, the worry of a migrant worker and the worry of a person who lives in a very upper class society can't be combined. Yeah, corona can't bring them together. One is about survival, one is about abundance. So I just want to say that the logic or the perception is very, very different, and therefore at some level I think it divides people at a very core survival essential level also.
So, yeah, and Dr. Saxena, do you see this as an individual issue? Well, we will in the media see this as one single problem the entire society is going through. But do you think this is, people are seeing it as my issue, my challenge, and therefore I need to solve this?
Well, I think I very much agree with what Aparna said, that although the coronavirus threat is a single one, but there are multiple other threats which are associated, which are affecting us in a very different way. It could be the loss of income, it could be the loss of job, it could be being away from family members and colleagues. It can be that I can't look after my own physical health anymore. I'm not getting the health services and so on. So all of that is actually having a much larger impact overall than the infection itself. And I would like to migrate on to the policy response and other responses, which are very much connected to these other threats which are happening. And government has a responsibility to see to it that not only the messaging is credible and correct and helpful, but also the restrictions which are being put are not unduly affecting some segments of society, which actually does more harm to them than others. So it should be the principle of equity and the principle of being fair to everybody that needs to be followed in putting these restrictions up and seeing to it that a corrective mechanism is available to look after the adverse effect of those restrictions. So to, take simple examples, to be able to pay salaries at the correct time, to make sure that basic necessities are being supplied, that those people who are not allowed to go out, is something which is very basic, which needs to be done. Similarly, to make essential health services available to people in spite of the overload on health services because of the virus is something which is absolutely essential, because you cannot let people die just because you are feeling the threat of death because of the virus. And that is something which is important. There is also the role of employers, not only the big companies which are employing hundreds of thousands of people, but each one of us who employs maybe one person, a driver or a maid or some help. It's our responsibility to see to it that their welfare is being looked after, because they are more vulnerable than we are. And that is something which all of us have the responsibility to do. And I'm happy to say that many people are doing it very well, actually, which is good. There is the responsibility of big employers to see to it that they do not take harsh measures at this time when everybody is suffering. So to take away people's jobs or to pay them much less salary or to threaten them with action is something which is totally unwarranted at this point of time. And they need to show their compassion at this point of time, because that will gain the loyalty of people much more when the thing opens up and they start doing their normal business. And finally, there is the responsibility of civil society organizations who have the responsibility to assist people who have nowhere else to go. because we do know, as Aparna was saying, that the government schemes are patchy and they leave a lot of people out. And civil society organizations which are at the ground level can see it immediately in their neighborhood. And they are the first ones which should step up to provide that kind of help, so that the eventual impact of these social and economic adversities is decreased as much as possible. Because if that is done satisfactorily, as soon as things become more normal, we will jump up and regain all the strength as individuals and as society that we need to have. Otherwise, the adverse effects will last much longer time, and we will be facing the social and economic consequences for years together. And this is the time for us to act, so that we can then regain it much, much quicker than we would otherwise.
So clearly, Doctor, I mean, there has been a lot of instances and news reports about demonstration of inclusive, compassionate action by communities towards their neighbors and co-workers and people who they support. And we've seen that in many instances across the globe. You're talking about government role, Doctor, and you've mentioned earlier in our discussion about the impact on the mental health and mental well-being will be there for a much longer time. One, of course, it is important for us to look at it from in an independent form, that we have to take care of people's mental health. But clearly that needs to be integrated into a lot of things that we do in this, on the ground in the social space, be it about providing medical facilities to taking care of their job or another thing. How do we get organizations and institutions like WHO, of which you have been heading the mental health department, and regional and other global institutions, to include mental health care into the broader strategy and scheme that they have built for providing resilience to the communities when they think of post-lockdown era and post-COVID era?
WHO has actually provided very good guidance, even in the last few weeks, on what the government should be doing. And it should be a whole of the government policy rather than just of the health department. Because as Aparna was pointing out earlier, and we have discussed at length, some of the social policies and economic policies have a direct impact on people's mental health, especially during these times. So the social determinants and economic determinants of mental health need to be actually looked after right now. And mental health aspect need to be kept in mind as we are devising these policies. So that's one. The second is actually to improve the mental health care and services. And I must point out, having also known the situation in many other countries, that when it comes to mental health, all countries are developing countries. Even economically advanced countries have a lot of catch up to do on their mental health services, and we need to act much more. When the burden of mental disorders is more like 10 to 15% of all health burden, the budgets allocated to it are between 1 to 5%. And in India, it's remarkably low. So we need to put in more resources on mental health. And although I know that during these times, it's very difficult to ask for more budget because everybody is saying that there is economic crisis, but putting more money in mental health and developing the human resources for mental health at this point of time will actually have a massive return on this investment. So the governments, also the central, the state, and even the district government must put in more resources on psychosocial assistance and mental health. And they should be community-based. We are not asking for more hospitals. We are asking for more community-based support, which can be by training doctors and nurses, by training the healthcare providers at all levels, down to the basic health worker, who can identify the sources of stress, can identify where more effort is needed, and so refer to the right place and provide the kind of help which will really prevent the mental health issues from getting out of hand. And all of that is needed now. We cannot wait. It has to begin right at this point of time so we can prevent rather than to look after the consequences when it has happened already. In fact, WHO has very clearly said that mental health must be part of all crisis management. And we are going through a textbook crisis, and we need to do that now.
Aparna, you have always been saying about looking at mental health from a psychosocial perspective, which means both psychology and social aspect must be considered. You work very closely with several governments, state governments also. What's been the observation you have been making? Are state governments and central government and government institutions more open to including mental health care in the larger scheme of things and understanding the need for it?
So, yeah, we have been working with very closely with many state governments, and I would suggest that it's heartening that when I started my journey within the mental health field, I think it was very jokingly, it's called Cinderella of health sciences. It was very neglected, a sister. And today I feel that definitely I think mental health is prioritized, but the reason why I use the word psychosocial is, as I said, that in a country like India, mental health is not just an individual issue, but it is very closely connected with structures, problems of living. And therefore, if you offer biomedical solutions to problems which are situated at different levels of ecology, I don't think it's going to work. Therefore, I think two observations when we work with government. Today, this emergency has suddenly, initially, I think everybody was worried about the health consequences and all resources and all focus was on health. I think we have been negotiating with governments as Dr. Saxena very rightly pointed that if you don't invest in mental health right now, it's really going to have tough effects and it's a good return on investment. So we have been working very closely, but it's not just sufficient to say that mental health has to be included. It is important to demonstrate how the psychosocial perspective has to be included. So one is through the public health system, be it the National Mental Health Program or the District Mental Health Program. But also, I think inter-coordination amongst ministries is the key. Because, as I said, mental health is as much a health issue as it is a women's empowerment issue or an employment issue or a social welfare issue or the youth ministries issue. So what we have been doing in ICOL over past many years, that we have been doing one, plugging in psychosocial perspective within the health and the mental health ministries, but we are also talking to other ministries which are within the larger ambit of development and asking them to integrate mental health discourse there also. So all of us then together talk the language of psychosocial discourse and have a coordinated response. So that is one thing that ICOL has been doing. And secondly, I'm very heartened to see responses from civil society organizations, philanthropists, or many voluntary organizations who are also in the space of mental health. But as I said last time also in the last conversation, that while I see this as a great opportunity, I think we have to be very careful about how we are using that opportunity and what is the discourse that is informing this opportunity. Otherwise, we may have some good souls, but we may not have such well-intentioned people also. So we have to be very, very careful.
Thank you. Before we move to the last part of our conversation, there's a question that has come up from Richa Sharma. How can people helping those in distress, such as social workers and counselors, manage their burnout in such difficult times? Aparna, you want to take that up?
Sure. So it's very interesting that I thank you so much for asking this question, because I'm a psychologist, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm still providing services on an everyday basis, and ICOL is doing that. And I always say when it comes to mental health, social work or psychology, we have a very selfless discourse. We believe that this is an activity without the actor, right? As if you are supposed to go on providing these services, but forgetting that self is the primary instrument that is providing this. So I think it's extremely important to talk about the burnout or even the hatred, violence, discrimination that is levied against health workers, mental health workers, or social workers. And I'm very happy to announce that ICOL, apart from providing community services, generic or COVID specific, is also planning to launch another helpline for health and mental health workers to take care of their burnout. because we are already receiving a lot of calls from social workers, mental health workers, health workers on our regular helpline. And these are complaints not only just about burnout, but actually infrastructural deficits, which will prevent, which will protect, which will maintain their safety and hygiene, which will actually protect them from discrimination also. So I think this is a very, very important issue. And I feel another thing, apart from providing support and actually infrastructural support and emotional support, we are into a lot of capacity enhancement, because everybody wants to do something but doesn't know how to do. So I think we are also offering a lot. People are moving to technology from a face-to-face mode, not trained. So we are offering a lot of capacity enhancement opportunities, and that is also giving people confidence and telling them that they are doing good work and giving them a direction of their work also. So this is a very important issue. Thank you for flagging that issue, Richa.
Manoj, I would just like to add that
Yes, doctor.
many healthcare providers and also mental health care providers somehow believe that nothing will happen to them. And actually, the example that I want to give is that when you fly, the air hostess tells you to put on your own oxygen mask before you put it on others. And I think we all need to remember that we need to look after our own mental health in a good way. Otherwise, we'll be less effective in providing the help that we want to provide to others.
Yes, doctor. Doctor, moving on to the last part, and before we ask your summary, professional life is also really seeing a lot of churn here. Actually, people are anxious about what does it look like 6 months down the line. If everything is behind us, would professional life be same? Would we go back to going to office, meeting people, social life coming back to normal days and all? Doctor, how do you see what kind of impact, what kind of crystal gazing can you do on people's professional life? How would it have changed? There are reports about IT industry in India saying that in the next 5 years, 75% of their employee base would be working from home in the next 5 years. And so what are we going with this, this aspect of professional life of individuals?
Manoj, I don't think I can predict too much because there is a lot of uncertainty and we don't know what the future will bring. But as the title of this webinar says, it's going to be a new normal. We certainly are not going in the next few years back to where we were. Some of the directions will be very good and helpful, and some of them will not be that good. It will depend on what kind of work you do and how you can contribute to that without putting yourself or others in danger, or without the necessity of commuting every day, maybe for an hour and a half and going to the work. And it has opened the eyes of many employers and employees that much can be done without being under the same roof, without being at the table on the workplace. And many, many things can be done. So certainly, there will be a move towards more flexibility in work environment, working remotely, working in groups without being in the same room. All of that is going to be definitely possible, but it will depend on the kind of work that you do and the kind of employer you have as to how quickly or how effectively you do that. But one of the aspects of mental health there will be, there are many intangible things that you do when you are at the workplace besides working, which actually give you support, which give you the immediate feedback. You've done something good or you've not done something good. And sometimes non-verbal ways of communicating and social ways of communicating are very important. So if we arrive at that reality that somebody is working completely remotely, we'll have to find newer ways of providing that kind of feedback, providing that kind of support, and still working effectively. So I think in this new normal, we will need to discover newer ways of working, which is not only remote versus being there. It's a whole new way of working that we will have to devise. And obviously that will be only possible for so-called white collar workers and professional workers, but there will be other changes which are going to happen down the line in other work environment. You know, how does the construction work goes on? How do the factories work? How does the agricultural work does? And all of that is going to require at least some changes, maybe not as massive, but there will certainly be changes. And the way we commute, the way we transport ourselves, the way we buy things, the way we study, the way we teach, the way we obtain healthcare, all of that is going to undergo some changes. But I have a feeling, and I'm an optimist, that quite a bit of that will be actually helpful. And we will, you know, I believe in the ingenuity of humankind and the resilience. I think we'll stumble on to something which is actually better than what we are facing now.
Dr. I think that's a very good segue to the last part I wanted to ask both of you is, what are the key lessons that you think we have learned, the world has learned, mankind has learned through, and what has humbled us in picking up those learnings through this COVID and the lockdown and other things that we have experienced over the last 2 months?
Yeah, I can.
Aparna, you can start.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can start, definitely. I think, as I said, that one of the first things that it has done is it has brought us face to face with finiteness of life, or vulnerability at a very core level. I realized that before COVID, we were going through the motions of living without taking that pause, stepping back and looking at life, looking at our own selves, looking at our bodies, feeling connected with the rest of the world. I think COVID has forced us to do that. It has forced us to step back, and I think it has told us about our finiteness. And I think we can take it with fear, or we can take it with gratitude, or we can take it with some amount of reflection. I think the choices are definitely ours. It has also told us that what is really, I think Dr. Saxena had said this earlier, what is really important for us. Yeah, because I think when you go through the motions, and I'm taking slightly philosophical tone here, but we are hearing these narratives that when people were living through the motions, they did not reflect to see what was genuinely important for them, how much they needed to live, how much was excess and how much was a necessity. I think that is also the second thing it has provided to people. Third is, I think it has really forced them without choice to look within, which was not happening, right? And it can be scary, or it can be a path to self-awareness. And the last thing, I think it has told us that regardless of how arrogant we are about our own existence, we cannot live without other people. So I think it has brought at a very core level the importance of social connectedness, which is a theme that we have been harping upon. And I hope we, through technology or no technology, we stay connected. I think that's the most important.
Dr. Saxena, your last words.
I think I will very much like to go back to what Aparna was saying, that there are two ways in which we derive lessons from this. One is to look inside, and one is to look outside. The inside lesson is to think again what is important for us, what is valuable for us, what do we really assign more value versus less value, and to then change the way we look at ourselves and we look at our life. So that is the introspection part. That is quite important. But the second clear message is that we live in an interconnected world, and what we do has an impact on others, and what others do have an impact on ourselves. Simple things like going outside the house could be dangerous to me and somebody else is a message that is very clearly being listened to. And I think that's something that we will remember, and we should remember for many other spheres of life, be it environment, be it community feeling, be it security, be it financial, economic matters. I think that message is much more important than just the health safety. What you do impacts others, and what others do impacts you. And if we can remember that message and carry it out in our daily life for some time in future, that will be a silver lining to the crisis that we are going through.
Great, thank you. And with that, we come to the end of this wonderful, exciting conversation that we have had today. I think the new normal, both experts agree that there will be a new normal, at least if for a near term, if not for a longer term. We will have to define how good that new normal will be for us. And even as we define that, we shouldn't forget the earlier normal that we had, so that we continue to have picked up lessons from there, staying connected, understanding our contribution to the larger world and making the contribution a much more positive, constructive way. And of course, self-care, taking care of yourself and your dear ones is very, very crucial to making sure that the community is resilient also. Thank you so much, Dr. Saxena. Thank you so much, Aparna. It was a great conversation, and appreciate your time this evening, and viewers also. White Swan Foundation continues to strive towards providing information on a regular basis. Should you want to regularly know about mental health care and this whole fascinating aspects of it, subscribe to our newsletter. Come to our portal www.whiteswanfoundation.org. Subscribe to our newsletter, and we will keep you posted and updated about everything mental health care. Thank you, and have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you, Dr. Saxena. Thank you, Aparna.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Manoj. Thank you for inviting us. Take care.